Imagine imagine you are a highly educated, fiercely dedicated religious enforcer.
Okay.
You possess massive social capital. I mean, you have a pristine reputation.
Yeah.
And your current, like all-consuming mission is to hunt down and destroy a new fringe religious movement that you view as a dangerous heresy.
Right. A total threat.
Exactly.
Oh.
So what single piece of data could possibly make you completely abandon your life's work overnight, dismantle your own power structure, and join the very people you were just hunting?
It is the ultimate psychological paradox. Because when we look at human behavior, especially religious or political extremism,
Yeah.
people double down when challenged.
Right. They don't just switch sides.
No, they don't. Confirmation bias practically guarantees that someone in that position will only seek out information that justifies their current crusade. They want to be right.
Which makes our source material for today's deep dive so incredibly compelling.
Oh.
We're looking at a text that documents exactly that kind of impossible pivot.
Yeah.
We're digging into a first-century apostolic letter, specifically Romans 1.2, written by the Apostle Paul. And we're going to map his ancient journey onto a very modern dilemma, like how we process information, combat echo chambers, and apply rigorous critical thinking to the things that fundamentally shape our lives. And specifically, what that means for a modern believer navigating the digital age.
What's fascinating here is that the mechanics of Paul's ideological shift, well, they offer a masterclass in cognitive flexibility.
Yeah.
If we look at first century Rome, the environment actually mirrors the overwhelming noise of our modern digital landscape.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, Rome was this massive, chaotic hub of imperial power, Greek philosophy, and polytheistic customs. You had dozens of competing ideologies colliding every single day.
It was like the internet before the internet.
Yeah, yes. Exactly.
Constant, unavoidable collision of ideas and worldviews, just everywhere you look.
And right in the middle of that ideological marketplace, you had the Jewish people attempting to fiercely preserve their faith and their ancient scriptures.
Right.
Into that highly volatile environment drops this completely radical group, the early followers of Jesus. And the sources mention they were originally called the Way.
And let's be clear, they were deeply misunderstood.
Deeply.
The Roman establishment viewed them as a political threat.
Yeah.
And the Jewish religious establishment viewed them as straight-up blasphemers.
Yeah.
Our source highlights the story of Stephen to show just how rapidly this misunderstanding escalated into violent, institutionalized persecution.
It was a brutal environment, and this is where we have to establish the mindset of the author we're analyzing.
Right, Paul.
Yeah, Paul, who was known as Saul at the time, he was not a bystander in this persecution. He was the architect of it.
Wait, I struggle with this because it goes against everything we know about how social power works.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Paul was essentially the equivalent of a Supreme Court justice mixed with like a specialized federal agent.
That's a great way to put it.
He was a Pharisee. Why would someone with that much social capital who is actively eliminating this group suddenly decide to pump the brakes and evaluate evidence for a fringe movement? It makes zero psychological sense.
That is the crucial tension of the entire narrative.
Yeah.
Because Paul didn't initiate this investigation because he was casually curious.
Right, he wasn't just bored.
No, the catalyst was an overwhelming, unavoidable confrontation with the very thing he was trying to destroy. His experience on the road to Damascus.
Yeah.
He's confronted by the resurrected Christ. But, and this is where the source material gets deeply analytical, that mystical experience alone wasn't the end of his process.
It wasn't.
No, it was merely the catalyst that forced him into a rigorous intellectual investigation.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because he had to figure out if what he experienced mapped onto objective reality, right?
Precisely. And that brings us to the core thesis in Romans 1.2. Paul is writing to believers in Rome, and he wants to establish the absolute legitimacy of this message. He states that the gospel of God was promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures.
So he doesn't say, I had a crazy vision, just trust me.
Exactly. He points directly to the historical textual data of the Old Testament.
He grounds the new paradigm entirely in ancient, verified source material.
Yes.
And the source we are reviewing actually frames this as a masterclass in critical thinking. Which is wild because usually when we hear critical thinking, we picture a modern high school class learning how to spot fake news on social media.
Right, right.
But we are applying a cognitive framework to a first-century Pharisee.
Well, the framework maps perfectly because the underlying human mechanism of seeking truth doesn't change.
Right.
The first hurdle Paul faced was defining the actual problem. The core contradiction was straightforward but monumentally difficult. Was Jesus truly the Messiah and the Son of God?
And that contradiction cannot be overstated,
No.
because to a first-century Jewish scholar, a crucified Messiah made as much sense as a defeated victor. It's a total paradox.
Yeah, it's contradictory.
It would be like claiming a CEO is a brilliant business mastermind, specifically because he intentionally bankrupted his own company and lost everyone's money.
Yes.
I mean, a dead Messiah was an oxymoron.
It was the ultimate scandal, because the Jewish expectation was a conquering political king who would overthrow Roman oppression.
Right.
Jesus was rejected by the religious elite, publicly executed by the state, and buried. From a superficial perspective, the data pointed to absolute failure.
Total failure.
If Paul were relying on the headlines of his day or the echo chamber of his fellow Pharisees, the case was closed.
But the shift happens because he refuses to rely on the prevailing narrative.
Right.
He bypasses the public opinion of the Sanhedrin and goes straight to the archives. He initiates an incredibly deep dive into the primary sources.
And Paul was uniquely equipped for this forensic historical research. As a Pharisee trained under Gamaliel, he possessed the ultimate academic and legal background.
Right. He was the guy for the job.
He didn't just have passing familiarity with the texts. He had internalized them. He had the writings of Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the Psalms categorized in his mind.
He had the data. I mean, the Old Testament was filled with specific markers regarding a coming Savior.
Yes, it was.
It spoke of a promised seed, a
Yeah.
suffering servant, a righteous king, and a new covenant. But having data and accurately interpreting it are two entirely different things.
Oh, absolutely. And that is where the cognitive heavy lifting takes place. Paul had to weigh this astonishing paradoxical claim that a crucified man is the savior of the world against the ancient prophetic texts he had built his life upon.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I want to dig into the actual mechanism of that evaluation.
Huh.
This is where the puzzle pieces snap together.
Okay.
How does a Pharisee cross-reference a crucifixion with ancient prophecy and come out the other side convinced?
Well, let's look at the specific texts he would have evaluated. Consider Isaiah 53. It describes a suffering servant, someone who is despised, rejected by mankind, pierced for our transgressions, and assigned a grave with the wicked, yet vindicated by God.
Wow.
For generations, the religious establishment struggled to reconcile this image of suffering with their desire for a militant king.
So they essentially filtered out the data that didn't fit their political goals.
Exactly.
They wanted a conqueror, so they just ignored the suffering servant parts.
Which is a classic failure of critical thinking. They let their desired outcome dictate their interpretation of the evidence.
Right.
But Paul, confronted with the reality of Jesus, revisits these texts and the blinders come off.
Yeah.
He evaluates the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and realizes it wasn't a tragic deviation from God's plan. It was the exact fulfillment of it.
So the crucifixion wasn't the CEO bankrupting the company. It was a completely different business model that they hadn't understood.
Yes.
And the source uses a brilliant phrase here. It says that for Paul, evaluating this evidence resulted in confirmation, not just persuasion.
And that distinction is profound because persuasion relies on emotion, charisma, or social pressure. Persuasion can fade when the emotional high wears off.
Right. People change their minds all the time based on a good speech.
Exactly. But confirmation relies on objective alignment. The claims of the gospel aligned perfectly with the historical data of the prophets. It wasn't a slick ideological pivot. It was empirical theological reality.
But reaching that conclusion creates a terrifying new problem for Paul.
It does.
Because once you conform that truth, you are faced with a massive cognitive dissonance. If Jesus is the promised Messiah, then the religious establishment Paul serves is entirely wrong.
Yes, and this is the agonizing cost of genuine critical thinking. When you evaluate the evidence and find that your core assumptions are flawed, you have to decide what matters more, your comfort and social standing or the truth.
Right.
For Paul, the logical solution was undeniable. If the evidence holds up, the only rational response is surrendering to it.
And the cost of that surrender was absolute. I mean, he had to dismantle his own power structure.
Click.
He walks away from his pristine reputation, his academic elite status, and his career trajectory.
Yeah.
He pivots his entire existence to preach the exact message he was previously imprisoning people for. The man who violently opposed the gospel becomes its greatest foundational theologian.
Because he followed the evidence wherever it led, regardless of the personal cost. And this historical reality brings us to the mandate our source material lays out for the modern listener.
Okay, let's go there.
Because the text doesn't present Paul's journey as a neat historical biography. It presents it as a blueprint.
So what does this all mean? Let's transition into that modern application. Right. Because in ancient Pharisees, research habits might seem, disconnected from a modern believer trying to navigate the absolute chaos of the digital age.
Sure.
I mean, we aren't debating theology in the physical streets of Rome. We are drowning in comment sections, algorithmic feeds, and viral ideological battles.
Mm-hmm. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the environment has changed, but the mandate is identical. The source issues a very clear challenge to modern Christians. The gospel cannot be treated as just another piece of data flowing through your feed.
Right.
In an era where we consume tens of thousands of digital messages a day, there is a temptation to reduce faith to a filed-away factoid or a cultural identifier.
We treat it like an aesthetic or a political affiliation that we just inherited and never actually stress-tested.
Yes, and the source material argues vehemently against that passive consumption. It defines the gospel as living truth from God.
Okay.
If it is living truth, it demands an active, rigorous investigation. Believers today are challenged to replicate Paul's exact cognitive method. Identify the claims, go to the primary sources, test the evidence, and then anchor your faith in what is confirmed, not just what is culturally persuasive.
I want to challenge that slightly, because asking a modern person to perform forensic textual analysis on ancient documents sounds incredibly daunting.
Oh, it sounds exhausting.
Yeah. I mean, most people aren't theologians with the time to cross-reference Isaiah and Romans over their morning coffee. So how does the source actually suggest a modern person evaluate this evidence practically?
Well, the source is actually very practical here. It doesn't demand everyone earn a PhD in ancient Hebrew.
Good.
It outlines 3 distinct, accessible areas where a believer must evaluate the evidence. The first, naturally, is the textual evidence.
Right, so going back to the primary source.
Yeah.
Opening the actual Bible instead of just reading a summary on a blog or listening to a 60-second video clip.
Exactly. Using both the Old and New Testaments to see how the promises map to the fulfillment, you have to actually read it for yourself, but it doesn't stop at the text.
No.
The second area of evaluation is communal. The source instructs believers to evaluate the witness of other followers of Christ.
Oh, that is fascinating. That is essentially peer review for your faith.
It is a brilliant analogy, yeah. You look at the empirical evidence within your community. When you observe individuals who have surrendered to this truth, does their lived experience, their transformation, and their resilience confirm the reality of the gospel?
Wow.
You are looking for the fruit of the ideology in real time. You're observing real people.
Which combats the isolation of the digital age.
Yes.
It forces you out of your private echo chamber and into observable human reality. Like you have to actually engage with people.
Exactly. You can't just be alone in a room with a screen.
So you have the textual evidence, you have the communal peer review, and what is the third area?
The third is deeply personal. It requires taking an internal inventory.
Okay.
The source says to evaluate the evidence in the blessings and transformations God has already authored in your own life.
So looking in the rearview mirror,
Yeah.
like where has this truth actually materialized in my day-to-day existence?
Exactly.
Where did a promise of peace or conviction actually hold weight when my life was falling apart?
Yes. You combine those 3 data sets, the historical text, the communal witness, and the personal inventory.
Oh.
And when you rigorously evaluate all 3, you are no longer blindly inheriting a tradition. You are actively confirming reality. And only after doing that heavy lifting do you make the conscious choice to trust what God has spoken and act upon it.
Which takes time.
It takes a lot of time.
The implication being that an investigated faith is a resilient faith.
Yes.
If you just adopt a belief because an algorithm fed you a persuasive video, that belief will collapse the second an algorithm feeds you a more persuasive counterargument.
That is exactly the danger of being driven by persuasion rather than confirmation.
Yeah.
The promise of this historical blueprint is that when you do the work Paul did, the gospel stops being a fragile idea on a page.
Right.
It survives the critical thinking process and becomes the unbreakable foundation of your entire worldview.
So you transition from a passive consumer of religious content to an active witness.
Yeah.
Because you know the facts.
Yeah.
You aren't just passing along a rumor you heard in a digital echo chamber. You have done the forensic work yourself.
And that level of conviction is what enables someone to withstand the immense cultural noise we face today. I mean, Paul was able to endure imprisonment, shipwreck, and eventual execution because his belief wasn't based on a fleeting emotional high.
Right.
It was rooted in verified, evaluated truth.
It fundamentally changes how we view information. The data we consume, believe, and act upon dictates the trajectory of our lives.
It really does.
Critical thinking isn't a secular tool to be feared by people of faith. It is the very mechanism a violent extremist used to validate the ancient gospel and become its greatest champion.
Yes.
He allowed the primary sources to correct his biases.
Which leaves us with a profound, almost uncomfortable mirror to hold up to ourselves. We've unpacked how a first-century Pharisee was completely transformed by the very truth he once fiercely rejected, all because he finally took the time to bypass his echo chamber and evaluate the empirical evidence.
He stopped reacting to the cultural headlines and went to the archives.
He did. So, in our modern era of constant digital noise, instant polarization, and deeply entrenched echo chambers, it forces a question.
Yeah.
What deeply held belief, or perhaps what fierce opposition, are we currently harboring simply because we haven't taken the time to rigorously gather and evaluate the evidence against it? What reality are we entirely blind to just because we refuse to do the work of checking the primary source?